Right, so I'm here to talk about data ethics and what our data ethics framework is, and how those principles help us to achieve what Tony was talking about. So, as a digital bank, we see ourselves as a fintech with a banking license. So we're taking the best of breed of what fintech has to offer, the innovations that are there, and applying that to the age-old business of helping people with their money. Tony mentioned we're not about products. In fact, we don't even define ourselves in terms of services. We're about the journeys of helping people basically master their money. Now, to do that, data is absolutely critical because the insights that we can provide with data, with digital particularly, is not agglomerate sort of averages of males get this, females get that, millennials will live this kind of life, people from a different age group or ethnic background will live a different sort of lifestyle. We can actually tailor it to the individual because that's what digital allows us to do, and that's the power of it. But when you get down to that level, it can get pretty creepy if we're not actually building a sense of trust with people. So our data ethics essentially is trying to shape the story of the relationship within the power of that data that we hold about our customers and our responsibilities as custodians of that data. Now, we all know this pattern pretty well. Every time we visit Google and do a search, we get something like that. I reckon if we did that as a bank and sort of said, Vault would like to use your location information, the reaction we're likely to get is, say what now? Why would you want my location information? We think there's a better way to achieve that outcome. We need to be much more transparent about what we want the data for, and more importantly, what's the value exchange? What does the customer get from sharing that data? We think something like this might work a little better, where we clearly define to you what the purpose is. We ask your consent with that purpose in mind. We'd like it because we'd like to offer you discounts for things that are nearby to where you are. We provide you with status, and in that status, we time box that consent. So we say, grant it to us for 180 days, and sometime within that period, say a week before, we'll surface that to you and say, well, you've been active since October 2018. Today is day 173 out of 180. And when you're now considering whether or not you want to extend that consent or to renew that consent, we can show you what the benefits were. You've received 193 location-based offers. You took up 38 of those. You saved a total of $217. We've put that money into your savings account that you call Holiday, and you've earned $3.14 in interest. And being able to provide that information, I think, helps people make a much more informed decision about whether to continue to consent. Now that's tricky, that's hard to do, which is why we've done all the work in the background about sort of creating a structure that will allow us to start sort of seeing that. And that leads us to our hypothesis, and there are two parts to it. If we're honest and transparent about the way we use your data and we let you know what value you get in fair exchange for that, then you'll be more likely to consent to sharing that data with us. And the second part of it is, if we can demonstrate the actual value of what you get in exchange for sharing that data, we think you'll be prepared to entrust more of that data to us for our mutual benefit. Because that data is the thing that's going to actually help you master your money, understanding your own behavior, how you spend, how you save, and so forth. And so the sorts of journeys we're building are incorporating ideas of gamification and so forth to actually help people move towards better behaviors with their money. There's an interesting observation with a service designer we were interviewing recently that, as we move more and more into this digital world, our relationships with the things that are important to us, like our money, our family, and our friends, actually become more isolated because it's all done through the digital medium. When we spend money using our cards and our Apple Pay and our watches and so forth, we don't actually see the money coming in and out because we just go like this, and it's done, and it's paid. The money's gone, and we don't really actually have an appreciation for that. Now, we think there's a better way. If we can actually demonstrate how you're actually behaving with your money, we might actually stand a chance in actually helping people come to terms with how they're going to master their money. And that's why we talk about it in terms of journeys and about the experience. It's all about the customer experience. Now, before I move on, for those of you who are at GAS 2018 in Phuket, I just wanted to say thank you very much for all the feedback that you provided in that first round when we surfaced our data ethics principles. You gave us some pretty candid and robust feedback, which has been invaluable in helping us sort of really tighten up what we mean by it. I won't go into all of the details of it, but essentially, our data ethics principles is about our commitment to keeping customers' data safe and ensuring that it's used responsibly. Our data ethics principles help us to deliver on this commitment. As part of good governance, we also invite comments and input in order to improve our data ethics principles over time, and we have external oversight to make sure we keep our data ethics principles. Because ethics, by its very nature, is defined by its context. It changes. As society's values and standards change, the ethics change as well, and we need to make sure that we keep in lockstep with those changes in values. So what are they? Essentially, there are 5 principles. Your data, we ensure it's used for good, we protect it, we respect it. We'll give you control and visibility of your data. We are honest about our use of your data. We use your data responsibly, and we use artificial intelligence wisely. Now, there's a lot of explanation that goes behind all of that, and I don't intend to go into it right now because I'll run out of time. But for anyone who's interested, we're more than happy to share those with you. But what I want to do now is actually talk about how we're actually bringing these ethics principles to life. And we've kind of defined 5 areas that we're working on, starting from the top left, risk framework and governance, culture and conduct, design and engineering, data processes, and tools and technologies. And I just want to walk through sort of examples of each of those to give you a sense of sort of some of the challenges we're facing and how we're dealing with them. So let's start with risk governance and framework. As I mentioned before, getting a sense of what the public feels, and in particular what our customers feel about our ethical principles and the data and security and privacy of that data is important. And one of the challenges we have is how do you get actually that voice of customer into something like that? Because I think if you speak to most people today, particularly young people and the millennials we're targeting, they'll probably go, meh, not really important, right? So how do we actually engage them at a level that they can actually participate? Because we believe that the participation of our customers is what creates the community that defines the cultural and ethical framework that we need. So one of the things that we're trying, we don't know if this is going to work, but it's an idea, we'll have an external a board to help us. So internally, in terms of governance, we'll have a data management committee. If there are ethical issues around our data, that will be surfaced to that committee for consideration so that we can work out whether or not we're doing the right thing. And we'll have an external board of specialists, people are practitioners in data ethics, in the law and so forth, to help us. Because we know that the regulation and the formal law itself probably lags a little way behind in terms of where we need to be, right? So one of the ideas we had originally was maybe we could have a customer board. But how would that board actually work? Because to get them to engage with topics like this might not get very far. So one of the ideas we have is maybe if we run it like a Q&A. So all of our deliberations are open on a digital channel for our customers to participate, submit questions, engage with the actual conversation while we're dealing with them, and see whether or not that would work. Now, we don't know if that's going to work, what's the moderation that's going to be required, etc., etc. But what we want to do is we have this idea of a Vault Labs, where we bring enthusiastic supporters of Vault Bank to come in, and we'll actually test that idea with them and see how we might actually make something like that work. Next piece is around culture and conduct, and that's absolutely critical, because if the people inside the organization aren't living and breathing what we're talking about, then I think pretty soon we'll find that all the good work that we've put into defining our ethics principles will start to dissipate. So in this regard, I'm happy to say that our data ethics principles, along with a whole bunch of other cultural and ethical sort of principles, have been incorporated by the board working group that's defining the overall culture and ethical framework for the organization. We've got the St. James Ethics Center coming in to consult to help us define that broader sort of ethical framework, but the data ethics is a central part of that consideration. One of the other things that I'm really keen on doing within the organization is bringing ethical challenges. So once a month, we'll put an ethical sort of dilemma out to people, to the staff, and actually engage them in a conversation and have a debate about sort of what's right, what's wrong, what's acceptable, what's not, why. Vote for them and so forth. So we'll work through sort of those issues so that dealing with the ethical dilemmas becomes part of our sort of, ongoing activity within the organization. And there are lots of candidates of those sorts of things that are constantly popping up. I have people coming up to me all the time saying, we're thinking of doing this, but we're not sure if it actually complies with our standing on data ethics. I want to comply, but I also have this dilemma in terms of what we're trying to achieve from a business outcome. And so we'll have those debates, and we'll actually raise those and actually engage staff in the conversation. Design and engineering is where what we're doing in terms of the ethics principles comes to life in the experience with the customer. It's the stuff that they see in the app and so forth. Now, at the previous GAS 2018, we talked about terms and conditions as one of the first things that customers experience from a consent perspective. Now, the traditional terms and conditions, as you probably have all experienced, is you get to the point where you're about to actually seal the sale, they surface this 64-page document to you, and you do this, and you go accept, and you move on. Because it's there as a point of friction to stop you from getting what you want to do. And we think that that pattern is fundamentally flawed, because that's not the time to surface it, right? We believe that comprehension is increased if we can provide disclosure within context. And so we've been working very hard with the terms and conditions. So at the last GAS, we talked about providing it in a different format so that people can progressively read through it and actually understand what it is they're committing to. But what we've done with the design team for a lot of our journeys, whether you're onboarding to the app, signing up for the first savings product, is that we disclose through that journey, as you're actually onboarding, the important terms and conditions, like the interest rate you'll earn, what fees you'll be charged, what are the terms of use of the app, and so forth. And it's progressively done. So at the point when you're putting in your password, we say, you must not share your password with anyone. And by the way, you need to have these certain things, for it to qualify as a strong password. And the reason we're doing it is for this, so that it's very clear in context why it is we're getting you to commit to that term and condition. And so at the end of it, rather than surfacing you a 64-page document, we play it back to you and say, you've been through this journey now, and you've seen these things, these are the important things, but if you want to read the legal document, here it is. But essentially, by the time you actually get to that point, you know what you've signed up for. Now, that's important for every part of the journey, but if you think of something as complex as a loan, particularly a home loan, right? This is what brokers used to do. Personal brokers, they'd walk through that process with you, and they get you to confirm that you understand those terms and conditions. How do we replicate that into the digital experience so that by the time the customer comes to the end of that journey and says, I'm ready to go, they know what they've signed up for. There are no gotcha moments later on. And that's what, for us, from a pub test, if you like, a rule, is that customers never feel like they've just been swindled when they actually have taken out the product. When they come out the other end and go, I didn't know about that. So that's what we're trying to avoid. And that's the challenge we have in terms of design and engineering. Data processing. This is one I know that Tony is particularly keen on. Gender-free. So all of the data processing that we do does not use gender as a variable. So in Australia, in the Australian context, we have the Australian Credit Bureau, and it's my understanding that they use rules to determine what your credit score will be. They do it for you for free. But if you're a female and you get to a certain age, then your score drops because they've worked out that you're probably going to have children, probably going to work less, earn less, or you're more likely to get divorced, and so all the risks associated with that factor into that equation. And it doesn't matter what sort of female you are, just because you're female, you get the free benefit of that reduction in your credit score. So it truly shows that gender-free, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, gender and free service. And we think that's inherently unfair. We think that not having that is much fairer. And that's the way we want our processing to work. Tools and technologies. Tony mentioned 134 and counting external services. We believe that a customer's privacy and security is worth more than any third-party supplier. So one of my roles in Vault is as service designer for internal alignment and internal processes. I've been working hard with our procurement area and extending it beyond that into the management sort of area of making sure that all of our third-party contracts have the right clauses and schedules in place that make sure that whatever data we share with them complies with the same standards that we have in terms of privacy, security, and data trust. Making sure that as we go through that process of finding vendors and so forth, that the business owners who will ultimately own the relationship with that vendor is actually going through and assessing what data are we sharing with that third party, what are they doing with it, how often do we need them to run their audits and report back, what if there's a breach, what's the time frame for the breach to be reported, what's the time frame for those breaches to be rectified and reported back to us, because we need to be sure that if we've got customers' data and we're sharing it with third parties to process for the benefit of the customer, that the same standard of ethical principles that we apply applies to our third-party vendors. And equally, if they do fail, the 3 times failure, what do we do, and how long does it take us to extract ourselves out of that in order to be able to deploy to a new service provider? I'm going to finish the conversation in the last couple of minutes talking about the challenges that we see ahead. First one is about measuring trust. And we've had some debates internally about whether that's even possible or whether we should even call it trust. I think we do, because my background is in psychology, and I'm an organizational psychologist by training, and we're all about, as a behavioral scientist, all about measuring the things that are typically regarded as immeasurable. But how do you actually measure that? The proxy today is propensity to share. So, how likely is someone to share data with us? But I think as an industry, not just within banking, but within the whole area of data and so forth, we need to start thinking more broadly about how we're actually going to measure it. We need to understand what the independent variables are that we would measure, the things that we would be able to use to increase propensity to share as an outcome, so the dependent variable. But what are the other dependent variable measures, the behavioral measures, for instance, that show that people are actually trusting you more, the things they may be saying in social media, the support that they have, the sorts of words that they would use to express sort of their relationship with you as an institution. So working out how we actually measure those things is going to be a significant challenge. And if we can think of ways to collectively, not just within banking, but across different industries, to understand how we actually measure trust, both the input and the output side of it, I think that would be really valuable. Second one is explaining AI and algorithms. We've heard this morning about what some of the challenges are around that, particularly for something like the bank. How do we explain how our algorithms work and so forth? That's going to be a big challenge. And if we can't, what do we do? What's the proxy for that? And the third and probably biggest challenge of all is how we remain trustworthy. So it's fine to establish the trust, and then at some point the customer trusts you, or maybe they just assume that the trust is there like they did with Google and Facebook to start with, until there's a breach. How do we avoid those breaches? And more importantly, how do we nurture and actually grow that trust? Because as we said before, the sorts of things that we could provide a customer as insights into their behavior from their spending is tremendous. But if we don't do this carefully, and if we misstep, then we could breach that trust very quickly, and a customer will suddenly lose all sense of their privacy and security being protected. Because the feedback that we've had from our research is, because we asked this question among millennials, the core group that we're aiming for, and their view was neobank, digibank, you're still a bank. And you're probably going to do the things that all the banks do. So we've got a challenge ahead of us in actually building that trust. But importantly, how do we actually maintain that trust going forward? And I'm out of time.
It's great. I love it if you can finish there, Dominic. That's fantastic, because we will then take a couple of questions. Certainly those, as you went round that last piece, the last two pieces in terms of gender-free, and Tony mentioned how many vendors you have. That last piece, it's been quite disruptive to the vendor.
It has.
The vendors you've brought in, hasn't it?
Yep, it has. In fact, one of them said, we want to use gender. We use gender as part of the thing, and we actually went back and challenged them and asked them why, what for.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. So we went into quite a lot of detail on what lies behind this and the material you gave out in Phuket. And obviously we're not in that level of detail but here today, but there's a lot of talk about this type of subject in the press at the moment, and I think Google came out with a framework, and it was reviewed and considered to be as useful as Pocket Lint or something like this, right? So is there the idea to, and it was discussed a bit in Phuket, is there the idea to take this out to more broadly into the market and to community and say, look, this is a good foundation of principles to kind of base our data ethics around? Is that on the cards? Or
yes, it certainly is. There's also the reality of what we have to manage from a PR perspective, because obviously we're being quite brave and quite advanced in terms of defining what the standards are going to be in terms of our ethical sort of position. Our competitors, particularly the legacy banks, will probably take every opportunity to throw pot shots at us. So it's something that we want to do, and we're working through at the moment how we actually surface those things in a way that's actually meaningful to customers, and then in other forums, perhaps sort of how we can actually engage with others, which is part of the reason why I'm here again this time, is to engage with other people who clearly get the issues around these topics, and try and work together on understanding what that is. So different sort of ways in which we might sort of approach the sort of, I guess, the sharing of those principles. So I'm happy to share that amongst sort of the attendees here, because we all know and understand how complex and tricky it is. But if we put that out into the sort of open ether, then some people might not take so kindly to.
If I can add to, we've already shared, when Dom's talking about sharing, Vault will give to anyone that wants it its complete principles outline and how all that works. And part of the reason why the board is happy to do that is we believe that actually, first of all, it was super difficult to come up with those things, and even when GDPR in Europe leads this space, even when we're talking with some of the leading people in Europe who sit on the committee bodies and stuff like that, doing things like Vault has an external governance board, and it has what is the exact terms of reference of that and what authority does it have over Vault. These things don't exist out there, and a lot of work has been put in from outside contributors and the Vault team to document all of this and work out how it goes. So the idea is we want to publish it to anyone who wants it for the purpose of helping other people get down that path. And the idea is, okay, if we publish it out, we'd love feedback back the other way as well for stuff that you guys have done. So it is very open. And then as Dom says, there's some radical things about it, right? One is the idea of the ethics committee when it meets is going to be live streamed and fully open. Now you can imagine what our lawyers are saying about that, right? They are freaking out about that. And we've got to work out how to deal with the commercial considerations when you're live streaming your committees. But that's what trust and open transparency means, right? And then again with the gender thing, the hardest bit for us was changing the regulator's view, because the regulator asks for us to collect gender, and the nice thing is that they give 3 categories: male, female, and unknown. It just so happens that every single Vault customer is unknown. That's how we can get through the system, right? So there's a lot of kind of practical considerations to getting these things done.
Yes, I have a question. Just take a typical example of commercial, just traditional banks. They normally, what they do is that they look at the customer and look at their families. They normally want, if you are have an account in a bank, and then we'd like to, invite your family to be in. What would you do in this case? I mean, they link, traditional banks, they just link different accounts, I mean, husband and wife and kids, and, provide something. This actually can influence their credit line calculation, and also giving that different opportunities for offers for customers. What would you do over here? I mean, in this case,
Can I take that, Dom?
Yeah. So one of the first things we're offering to the market actually is savings, because we think that traditional banks offer you a savings account, but a savings account doesn't actually help you save. What helps you save is helping you understand how you're behaving with your money, right? So one of the things we're doing, the reason why we're putting savings out there as the first proposition, is to actually gamify, your behavior, so that you help you to save. Because we understand that if people can actually achieve that, and if they have the discipline, they can move towards that, then that is a much better predictor, we think, of a person's propensity to be able to then repay their finance. Because they've actually demonstrated the behavior of being able to put money aside, and therefore that money can be used to finance a loan. So effectively what you're doing is just inverting the commercial sort of equations here. And we think that it's part of the whole behavioral economics and behavioral science. Behavior is a much better predictor than all the other historical indices. Just like gender is not a good predictor of how much you can repay. Yeah.
So you've emphasized a lot gender and not using gender. I assume you would take the same position on ethnicity, like Aboriginal versus not Aboriginal, or something like that.
Yeah, and that will be a really tricky one too, because I think the regulators might require us. I know that from my experience in government, and I was working in government for 10 years, sometimes we actually have to capture some of that information for the purposes of reporting.
But you don't have to use it.
But we don't have to use it for the calculations. That's right.
But you emphasize behavior.
Yes.
Yeah.
And from behavior, I can
Infer
that. So
Absolutely.
which geography I live in, or even which fast food restaurants that I go to, are a very strong indicator of ethnicity. So are you going to avoid all of those things as well?
Yeah. It's
No.
a good question.
We're absolutely not. So first of all, we don't store ethnicity. There is no storage field, and it will not be kept in the data warehouse. Where it's needed for regulatory purposes, which I don't think we actually do need, it will just be a pass-through of that documentation. And I think, of course, we will use behaviour. The thing is, we've got to check for, let's use gender as an example, we've got to check for bias. Even though we don't store gender, we've got to check for bias. The way we check for bias is some names are generally pretty female. There's a lot of Susans that happen to be girls. There's a lot of names that you can't be sure about in the middle, and there's a lot of boy names that are boys. So we just reverse it back from name to work out these people are probably female, these people are probably male, and we do our bias check in the background around that. And how we do it for ethnicity, to be honest, we haven't thought that out yet. But most things have a way of reverse engineering some sort of proxy to check that we're not being biased. So maybe you can help us, Stephen, with how we do it for ethnicity in a back way, or even if we need to, right? I don't know whether we do.
Okay, I know there are more questions. I apologise, we don't have time, but both the guys will be around at lunch, if you can grab them then, because we've got to keep tight to time. Once again, thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Dominic. Thank you.